All right. Sorry about that. Bit of a delay here. Tonight's speaker, I know a little bit more than our other speakers, which is a great honor and privilege, as he's my brother. We've spent a lot of time together throughout the years, so it's very, very nice to have him here and very nice to have you here. Thank you all for coming out on a very cold, blustery evening. Father Anthony graduated with an MDiv from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary in Boston in 1989. He married and moved to Greece and studied Byzantine icon painting and Byzantine art history for 6 years. He paints churches, lectures, and teaches throughout the country. He was ordained in 1999, and he's pastor of St. Philothea Greek Orthodox Church in Athens, Georgia. So, a very short trip in terms of the name, but a very long trip in terms of travel. He's married with 2 sons and 2 grandchildren, and he's my brother. He wrote on this, just to remind me. So we're very honored and happy that Father Anthony could make it, and thank you all for being here again.
This is exciting. I know on paper it looks like the worst case of nepotism ever, and it probably is, but I got something so exciting to share. And as Uncle Ben said to Peter Parker so prosaically, to whom much is given, much is required. So I'm going to, it's like taking a sip from a fire hydrant, but I'm going to give it all to you and you decide what you want to do with it. So Theology Matters is a great title because we live in the generation of the disincarnational. We are spiritual, but not religious. People don't realize that that's an oxymoron. As if the church were not body and soul. It's a divine human institution. I'm not so crazy about the human side sometimes, but that's the way God designed it, on purpose. So we have to, as St. Paul says, work out our salvation in fear and trembling, and to do the good works that God has willed for us. So, how do we get this? Where does that come from? Tonight what we're going to talk about is ontological reality, orthodoxia and orthopraxia, how we incarnate our faith into this world. Now, in this modern age, our kids are oversaturated with stimuli and movies and their phones, and they're constantly on social media. And they have a perception of what is the transcendent. Now, how do we transcend the material world? And they might think it's just magic. Like Harry Potter, you wave a wand and poof, bada bing, bada boom, you get what you want. Or Iron Man, or Superman with computer-generated images. That's kind of the 21st century version of transcendent, but in the end it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't take you out of yourself. It may entertain you and distract you for a while, but it doesn't fill your soul. Now what we see in spirituality, say, look at Renaissance paintings. Renaissance paintings are beautiful, well done. We have an expert in Renaissance painting in the audience, lots of experts I found out, so I know I'll have a lot of hecklers out of there by the end of the night. But in the Western version, we see the use of perspective. We see lovely cherubs and visions of spiritual things. And in a sense, it kind of turns you into an observer. And I'll explain that later about that use of perspective and creating atmosphere in images. But in the East, what you have is a vital, energetic, expressive visual language. And it is the perfect language, liturgical language for the transcendent. In other words, it's the best we can do. Because if you try too hard on one side, it comes out as magic. If you try too hard on the other side, it becomes sentimental and unreal. We don't believe it. So down the middle of the road is this expressive visual language called Byzantine iconography. So, how did we get there? We start with art. Art history changed my life. I was studying industrial education, then I switched to industrial design. Part of my coursework was art history. So I took art history, and that excited me. Something lit up inside me. I said, that's what I want. And so, it might have been better to stick with art appreciation, but I ended up going into art theology, two highest paid professions. So I studied painting, and what they say about art is that it's visual philosophy. It expresses what we believe about the world. So here we see, this is cave painting, and this is obviously the hunt. It shows two things. It shows what they're doing, and it shows the personality of the people behind it. When we call this a visual language, think of a spoken language. Russian sounds different than Spanish. It sounds different than German. Each language has its own character, its own personality. So art has content and it has personality. So we look at the Egyptian painting. Now we would consider this perhaps very primitive. It's a very flat. We have profile and frontal together. We see words in the background. We see the use of scale to indicate importance and expression. So what may look like a primitive language is actually very sophisticated. You'll see how we use that in iconography. Let's go to the Greeks. The Greeks were all about history and mythology and story and figurative works. Jump up to the Impressionists. What was the time of the Impressionists? Those were paralleling the philosophers. We had the existentialists. What is it to be? And so they weren't saying anything really profound by their paintings. What they were saying is about what is the experience of being and the reaction of light on the eye, the impression that it gives. We jump forward to Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky revolutionized art. He was the father of non-objective painting. And now this was a big deal because up to that point, art had been descriptive. It had been telling us a story. And now he's telling us it has another capacity. It has the capacity not to mean something, but to be something. And that opened up all kinds of worlds of what the possibilities are on a two-dimensional canvas. Roy Lichtenstein took that and he made these paintings that were kind of comics, but he returned to the integrity of the two-dimensional surface. He didn't try to create illusion with it. He created form through the use of line, but it's basically a flat surface. So, now we go to the Orthodox Church. This visual language, how are we to understand it? Well, in Orthodoxy, we say we have orthodoxia, that is correct worship or glory, doxology, and we have orthopraxia, that means action. How do we behave? How do we live as Christians? So this church is Gratsanitsa, and it is a beautiful church. Apparently it got bombed. I haven't seen it since it was bombed. It was hit during the wars in that area. You see the outside is very humble materials, a lot of arches, beautiful but simple place. Inside it's decorated with beautiful icons. As Christians, we should be humble on the outside and decorated with virtues on the inside. So, back to the art, the visual art of iconography. We say orthodoxia, orthopraxia. So art has two capacities. It has content. Here we have Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it has expression or personality. So we would say this is a descriptive painting of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. We wouldn't say it's a Byzantine icon. Byzantine iconography, as a visual language, wasn't invented by one person sitting in a room and thinking it all out and giving this book of iconography. It was really two cultural streams coming together. This is a 9th century icon of the Ascension, and it has some of those elements we saw in the Egyptian art. This is from what we call the monastiki laiki, the kind of the folk art of the East. And we see that it's a very expressive art, but it's also symbolic art. Here on the center axis, we have the two most important figures, Christ and the Virgin Mary. We see the Virgin Mary is a head taller than the apostles. This is, again, that importance of scale. Not a physical reality, but a spiritual reality. We also see that she has a halo, and around her halo is a burning bush. That's a reference to Moses and the burning bush. The bush was on fire with God, yet not consumed. The Virgin Mary was on fire with God, not consumed. And that is the icon we put as we approach to receive the body and blood of Christ in Holy Communion, so that we are on fire with God and not consumed. We also see that Christ is in his mandala, and that is in his glory. He's not always depicted in his glory. For instance, in the baptism, he descends into the River Jordan. In the Transfiguration, he is in his glory, in his mandala, because he reveals his nature. And then we also see something here to show just how sophisticated this is. The hands behind the mandala, it shows that it's translucent. So to say that they didn't know what they were doing, they really knew what they were doing in terms of painting. And then what we see too here is that the apostles, they're stacked up on top of each other. In other words, we want to see them. So we're not going to limit ourselves to visual, like taking a photograph. We say, like kids, Grandma, she's the most important person. We're going to put her 10 feet tall. She bakes cookies. The dog we're going to put on the roof because, well, we don't have a place for it. They're free with their two-dimensional surface. So here we don't follow physical rules. We follow common sense and spiritual rules. We also see that there's bodies under these garments, so linear design is very important. But the faces are not renderings. They are expressive, almost cartoon-like. So combine that with Hellenism. Hellenism was the art of the Greeks. And the Greeks used a system for measuring. So if you take your nose and measure your head is 4 noses tall. Your body is 7 heads tall, 7 to 8. They would use that so that they really wouldn't have to copy nature, but they would have a system for creating reality. Well, they took these two systems together, and here we see them both. Go back here. So here we see them both. Here is that Byzantine frontal expressive look, big eyes, flat. Here we see in the back the angels. Now something's different about the angels. Their heads are turned. We see foreshortening. That introduces atmosphere into the painting. So we have the East and the West, and then in the center we have the Byzantine. That is the linear, the expressive, the classical pose, the modeling, the form. Those come together. We create this language that transcends physical reality and puts us in touch with God. And that's the limitation. That's what we're working with. So we try and do it in such a way that our minds and our hearts are connected. This we call the noetic prayer, the nous, when the mind descends into the heart. And that's a very Eastern understanding of theosis, or the role, the purpose of Christian life is to become like God. So, what we see in our churches, it took a while. I mean, after Constantine and after the Edict of Toleration in 312 AD, once he conquered Rome and moved Rome to Constantinople, and they're still mad about that, but he did. And he established, he put the state behind the church, so the church had resources and persecution ended. So now they begin to build temples, and the first thing they come up with, the basilica. The basilica was like the governmental power. So now this was the church, and they had this hierarchy. They had the stoas, the 3 aisles, and then the apse at the end. And depending on how important you were closer or farther from the altar of the church. But with the development, you see this in Justinian when he built Hagia Sophia, once they figured out how to build arches and domes and cover great areas of space with their architecture, then the material world begins to reflect the theology and our understanding. We don't have spires and piers reaching up to heaven, we have domes that bring God down to earth. And in that space, within a church, they're really designing the interior church for the iconographer. Because those spaces, those domes, those conchs, those arches, all bring those surfaces down to us so that we can be in communion with God through the images. So here are several variations, and they all follow kind of a similar pattern, a similar layout, which I'll explain to you in a minute. I just wanted to show you that it's not a cookie-cutter thing. Every region has different materials, has different weather patterns. In Russia, they use the onion dome. In Greece, where they don't have these huge temperature shifts, they have the regular spherical dome. It just depends on the art and the architecture of the culture you're in. This is a church that my good friend we saw earlier. This is one that George Corlys painted. We studied together at the Boston Museum School back in the day. He was from Greece, and I had just come to seminary. And he said, Father Anthony, I was Father Anthony, man. It was Wayne, but he said, Wayne, we got to go study at the Boston Museum School. And I said, what are we going to study? He says, painting techniques. And I said, why? He says, because you got a car. See where this is going. But I'm glad we did, because he was a trained iconographer, and they taught us fresco, mosaic, gold gilding, and they tempera. And they had never seen anybody use it the way he used it. He was a master. Now what you're looking at is a church that he painted in Indiana. He's actually done about 10 churches here in America, and he has a team, highly trained professionals, and they paint a church. It takes them about 6 weeks. He grabs some chalk and starts drawing, and they follow behind him, and it just transforms before your very eyes. It's an amazing thing to see. Very talented. So he's worked about 20 hours a day for the last 20 years, and I've worked about 10 hours a day, so he's about 20 years ahead of me. Literally, he is. He's a great artist. But what we see here is, in the dome, we see Christ, the Pandokrata, the Almighty, and he's surrounded by the cherubim, the seraphim, the archangels. And below that, you have the next order of created beings, the prophets, and the fathers and patriarchs of the church. And below that, you have the scene of creation and the fall. And then below that, you have the story of redemption. So this is all how the program of iconography developed to tell us the story of salvation. Okay? So we also see just a couple other things to point out. Here we see Christ. He's blessing with his right hand, and he's holding the book of the Gospels. So with his right hand, he's spelling out his name. Jesus Christos. I-C-X-C, Jesus Christ. He also has a red garment on the inside and a blue garment on the outside. Red is a symbol of divinity. So as he took on flesh, he was wrapped in blue, humanity. These colors are reversed on the Virgin Mary because her humanity, at the descent of the Holy Spirit, was wrapped in divinity. And then outside the dome, they'll either have a rainbow sometimes, or sometimes they'll write a verse from Isaiah, Lord, Lord, look down from heaven, and behold this vineyard which your right hand has planted and you have established, which is a line the bishop says just before the reading of the epistle and the gospel, and he blesses people. And what he's talking about is this local Eucharistic communion. And that's very important. We have a small community, about 50 families in Athens, Georgia, and I appreciate what it takes to keep the doors open. It's a lot of work. It's a full-time job. And our parish council president recently said, because as you all know, numbers are dropping. Kids are not coming to church. People are kind of moving their thumbs around and saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Now Rose says, she's a convert to Orthodoxy, she says we have to keep it open long enough for them to realize that this is what they want. That is communion. They want communion with God. So iconography has really become the new evangelism. We painted a church in Columbia, South Carolina, and shortly after we finished the first installation, they had their festival. 10,000 people came through, and they walk in, and people would start crying because they haven't seen anything that beautiful before. We painted a church up in Pittsburgh, and the priest says I get 2 or 3 families converting a month because they see it, and they go, wow, what is this? So let's look at this and see exactly what it is and how it works. So we have the dome, and the dome is the beginning of time, Christ, the pre-eternal Word. We come down into creation. We have at the base of the dome, I'll go back here for a minute, we have, let's see if this one has it. Go back. Okay, here in the pendentives, we have the 4 gospel writers, because those are the 4 pillars of the church. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are pendentives that Justinian designed to join heavenly power with earthly power. So he's putting a dome on a square. And that is an architectural feature that they developed. So in that are the pendentives. We have the gospel writers. Then, at the back of the church, we have the Panagia, the All-Holy One, the Theotokos, that is the God-bearer, the Mother of God. And she links the heavens with the earth through her yes to Archangel Gabriel. So here we have the Virgin Mary enthroned. This is a chapel I painted in Mexico, private chapel. And theologically, as my brother said, theology matters. Here we have Christ as a child. That means he has a mother. But in his halo, he has a cross. In the cross is written the Greek participle oon. Oon means the one who is. Remember the burning bush. What did he say? Who are you? The answer was, I am the great I am. I am the source of being. I am the source of life. So here we have Christ as a child with a mother, and she's wearing red on the outside, blue on the inside. Her humanity was wrapped in divinity at the descent of the Holy Spirit. We have the archangels, Michael and Gabriel, and the descent of the Holy Spirit. This is a church, Stavra Nikita Monastery on Mount Athos, and it shows the same thing. We have here, this is the Holy of Holies, the altar area, the Virgin Mary is on the back, and then we have the cross, the Virgin Mary, and the icon screen. The icon screen is that place that divides the nave, naval term, that is, we call the church the Ark of the Covenant. That means it is where we come to be saved. So we have the narthex, which is that transitionary from the world into the kingdom of God. So when you leave the world, you leave time and space, and you enter eternity. Because that's where you're going to experience God. Because the future hasn't come yet, the past is gone. So we experience it now and in eternity. That's why it's important to come to church. You can't receive communion on your computer, right? Not yet. So this is, so we have the icon screen, and to the right of the holy doors, or to the left, we have the Virgin Mary and Christ as a child. To the right of the holy doors, we have Christ as a grown man. So on the left, it represents the incarnation. On the right, it represents the second coming of Christ. So in between the incarnation and the second coming, we have the church. And that is the holy doors. Now, I was talking to some high school kids one time, and said, we were sitting on the solea, and the altar was there, and I wasn't a priest yet, so I was just talking to them, and I said, so you guys know what sacred space is, right? They said, sacred space? What are you talking about? You're bored, just leave us alone. So I started to walk into the altar, and they all went, and I said, that is sacred space. Because you know, only priests, bishops, and deacons go through the holy doors. So intuitively, you have a sense of sacred space. My son, when we lived in Greece, it was a very small church, and we were right next to the altar area. He started to walk in, and I grabbed him right before he went through the holy doors, and I told the priest, oh man, that was close. He says, oh, that's okay, we ordain him a deacon and say, Oxios, he's working. I said, give him a little time. He actually ended up going to Greece, graduated high school in Athens, and then went to Greece immediately and studied theology there, and he's still there 8 years later studying, doing a master's degree, so God knows. So, iconography is both didactic in that it teaches us the theology of the church, but aesthetically it makes us feel the theology of the church. Here we have an icon, and we know it's in the altar area because there's the part of the icon screen. So we know that it has to do with the liturgy. All right. So even if we don't know Greek, we see the story going on. Here's a woman and a man offering hospitality. We have 3 angels. So this is called the philoxonia to Abraham, the hospitality of Abraham. And here is Abraham with a knife at the throat of Isaac. Obviously, this is a reference to the sacrifice, God offering his only son. Here we also see that the angels are 3 distinct persons. That is, the 2, the one in the center and one in the left, are bowing to the one on the right. They all have share one garment of one color, telling them that they are one essence, but they are 3 distinct persons. Here, so within the Trinity we have unity, but we also have hierarchy. So the 2 bow to the one, showing that the Father is the Creator, the Son is begotten, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from. So that this is our icon, it's called the hospitality of Abraham. It's our understanding and representation of the Holy Trinity. This, without knowing Greek, you'd say, oh, this is the nativity icon. It is Genesis. Genesis sounds like Genesis. So it is the birth of Christ. Now, it combines many parts of a story over a long period. Here we have the visitation of the Magi. Here we have Christ wrapped in grave clothes and placed in a tomb. That's foretelling why he came into this world. He comes into the darkness of this world, a cave, not a manger, in a crib. We have from Isaiah, the ox and the ass recognize their master. Here we have the Virgin Mary, and Joseph is separate. Joseph is always shown with a worried look on his face to capture that part where he says Joseph was a righteous man, and he thought to put her away quietly, knowing she was pregnant, not married, she would be stoned. The angel of the Lord reveals to him that this is of the Holy Spirit. Up here we have the shepherds, the star, Bethlehem, and then down here the daughter, Salome, of Joseph. He was an elderly man, and the midwife, and they're giving Jesus a bath. So he's perfect God and perfect man. And then the Virgin Mary, you can't see it very well, but she has 3 stars, one on helmet and one on each shoulder. That represents virgin before birth, during birth, and after birth. So there's a big controversy because it says, well, Jesus had other brothers and sisters. Well, in that culture, anybody who was a cousin would be considered a brother or a sister. Greeks even today, they call anybody who's older than them, they call them aunt and uncle, theos, thea. We know that he was her only son because of the crucifixion. Jesus entrusts her to John. It would have been anathema to not take care of your relatives if you were a child. So since Jesus was the only child of the Virgin Mary, he made sure that she was taken care of. These are icons by my teacher, Costa Fodiales, of blessed memory. He passed away a few years ago. But what you see is this is in the exonartheca. This is in the outside narthex. There's 2 registries of scenes from the Passion of Christ. And this is what we see from here is when he's before Caiaphas and he rips his clothes, he rents his clothes, and this is Pontius Pilate washing his hands. And then over here we have the Virgin Mary, Anastasia Pharmacolithria, that is the pharmacist, and then the empress who donated the monastery, and then over on to their left we have 3 virgins. So in iconography, we tell you a lot of things, we teach you a lot of things, but we also make you feel something. I mentioned earlier about the use of atmosphere. Icons are very flat. In fact, they use reverse perspective. Giannini said in the 15th century, trying to get rid of those Byzantines. They knew nothing about perspective. Well, they knew a lot about perspective. They used it in a very particular way. They made the focal point you, so that you are part of the event. So when we celebrate our hymnography and our feast, we say, Simeron Christos Genate. Today Christ is born. Because for God, it's a now moment. He transcends time and space. The aesthetics that we use make sure that there's no atmosphere. In Western art, they've really perfected the use of atmosphere, the telephone poles going into the distance, the roads going back in space, and they create this illusion of space. That's what it is. It's an illusion. And it turns you into an observer. You are watching something happen. But in iconography, you are right there. You have an epiphy. You have a relationship with the image. In fact, if you ever gone to Olan Mills, they use an ancient Byzantine trick to make the images dynamic. They turn you away slightly from the camera and they get you to look back at it. Well, that's so your eyes will be in relationship wherever you go. They're looking at you. So you are not a passive bystander in church. This is liturgia. This is the work of the people. You are a worshiper. It's a participation activity. And then these are virgin martyrs. So you'll see here, go back here, they're holding crosses, and here we see a hand. That hand is a signal. It says, I will not deny Christ. So they're pointing out their allegiance to Christ, and they will die for Christ. And this particular style is known as the Paleologan style of painting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, there was a period, a little glitch in history of the church, known as the iconoclastic period, or the ikonomachy, the war against icons. And how did that come about? Well, Emperor Leo III, the Assyrian, he was raised and influenced by Muslim culture. And he saw images as idols, or as graven images. He says, we cannot depict God. So, whenever there's a controversy, and especially if they had Twitter back then, it would explode on the internet, and people would be arguing back and forth. Well, it was St. John of Damascus and St. St. Theodore the Studite. St. Theodore the Studite. And they defended icons, and they used an incarnational argument. This is what they said. They said, because the second person of the Trinity took on flesh and dwelt among us, we could see him. He had a prosopon. He had a face. Say, took a coin, a piece of metal, and they say, this coin is just a piece of metal. But when you stamp the image of the emperor on it, the empire stands behind that coin. We all have pictures of our relatives on the wall, and we will kiss the picture. We're not kissing the chemicals and the color and the paper. We're kissing the hypostatic nature represented by the image. They also made a distinction between latria, worship of God alone, and proskynesis, that is reverence due to people of importance, and that is the saints. So we don't worship the saints, we worship God alone. But we reverence and honor the saints because they have achieved theosis. They have become like God in this life. So it was two women, and so we call these windows to heaven. So when you see, one of our students went to Greece one time, she was a Baptist at the time, and she went to Greece, and she was doing mission work in Romania. Somehow, people that go to Romania trying to do mission work come back Orthodox. But she went there and she said, this old couple came into the church and very reverently did their sign of the cross and kissed the icon. She said, I can't write that off so fast. Something's going on here. I don't understand it. I want to find out what it is. So she came to me, and through a series of talks and participation, she eventually understood it and she became Orthodox. So that is how we communicate. So this iconoclastic controversy that began in 736 and ended maybe 150 years later, it was ended by Empress Irene. We have two women at the time. Empress Irene called the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 785. Nobody's going to stop me. Father, the Seventh Ecumenical Council was 786. I stand corrected. You're right. She called it in 785, but there was such an outroar, she had to wait a year. Things settled down. They said, icons are not only... Another microphone? Testing. Yeah, that works. Okay. So, Empress Irene restored icons. She said they're not just an ancillary part of our faith, they are an essential part of our faith. If we deny the icons, we deny the incarnation. So, Theophilos came behind her and outlawed them again, and Empress Theodora, the wife of Theophilos, restored them, and we celebrate that on the Sunday of Orthodoxy. That is the first Sunday in Lent. And we process around the church, we carry icons, we proclaim that this is what the universe believes. We have hyperbole. Everybody knows that this is the absolute truth. So when I go to Baptist churches and I see blank walls, I say, I don't know, they remind me of my dentist's office. Maybe that's comforting, but we're leaving behind a lot. We're leaving a lot on the table. So with the resolution of the iconoclastic controversy, icons began to be painted again. And it was for 150 years, all they used was crosses. If you go to churches in Cappadocia, you'll find old churches just covered. Big crosses, little crosses, decorative crosses. Crosses, that's all they used. But then, after that period, icons began to develop. And the program that I explained to you earlier about how we decorate a church began to evolve and develop. I tell my art students, I said, yes, there's canons to iconography. Paint a certain way. But that doesn't limit your freedom. It's like railroad tracks. railroad tracks don't limit the freedom of the train, they allow it to go places. So these are our railroad tracks to guide us. I was in Romania about 4 years ago participating in an international colloquium of iconographers, and the title was Modernity and Tradition. And George, my friend, put this symposium on, and he says, I don't like that title. It makes it look like we're contrasting modernity and tradition, when in reality, modernity is part of tradition. We are not a museum trying to preserve ashes. We are an incense burner containing fire. And we need to bring this light and life to the people where they are. When I painted a church in Mexico, I used the colors of Mexico. Very bright, very festive. So we all have an accent when it comes to faith. In other words, we incarnate it in a time and a place with a personality. You go to Ireland and they'll say, oh, you have an accent. You'll say, oh, you have an accent. Well, guess what? We all have accents. We incarnate faith. So, this particular period, after the Resolution, the iconographic style is known as the Comenium style. And you can see how brilliant it is. It's a very strong linear design. And the linear design, iconography begins with line. It is what gives it life. And then the modeling of form is what makes it relational. So here we see that if this were, if we went to a museum in Greece and we saw the head of Neptune or something, you see how cleverly they understood shape. So this hair is highlighted, say from the upper left, so this side is in shadow, this is in highlight. You see the highlight here, and then you see this piece of hair curled down underneath there. That's how much precision and control they had in rendering the form. I tell my students, if you don't understand the form that you're painting, put down your brush. You have to understand the form or you won't know what to do. So these people were brilliant painters and artists, and they understood how to create. And this period of iconography is known as the Comenium, as I mentioned, but it was a very linear and a very expressive art form, which is kind of an acquired taste of the West. We like the more realistic. The Cretan school is very popular in the West, but this was a very dramatic and expressive period. This is in Agios Panteleimos in Skopje, and it's called the Epitaphios, or Christ in the Tomb. And we see here earlier what I said about the spiritual hierarchy importance. Here we're seeing the passion of the Mother of God embracing her Son, expressing her penthos. And here it's almost as if Christ is levitating. Doesn't matter. That's not the important part. The important part is her passion and love for Christ. We also see St. John, and on their faces are expression of controlled penthos. We don't show despair. When we show Christ on the cross, we don't show the suffering and the pain and the gore. In fact, it looks like he is supporting the cross. He is shown in control, that he freely offered himself for the life of the world. So it looks like we're depicting that he was in control, and not necessarily the pain and suffering that he went through. Following the Comenium period, we have the Paleologan period, and you have to remember, again, thinking incarnationally, what was going on in the empire during the Comenium period. They were powerful. They had money. And what happens when you have money and power? You become dumb. So the images that they used were powerful expressions. They have in Daphne Monastery, just outside of Athens, what they call the angry Christ. It's a very powerful image. And so when you're praying and you're looking up, or if your mind's wandering, you look up and you see that image, and suddenly you're sobered up. You remember this is serious business. Well, during the Paleologan period, and I'll mention a date you all remember, 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. They're still mad about that. But that represented the decline of the empire. And so what do we see during this period? We see a less powerful image of Christ, and we see a more human image of Christ. We see more his mercy and love, whereas before we saw his truth and holiness and righteousness. Now you recognize this as from the Deesis on the second level of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or Constantinople as we refer to it. And here we see, this is a mosaic, and you see just how brilliant and what a masterpiece it is of iconography. This is all stone, but look at this, the warm in the cheeks and the cool in the shadows. This is really a beautiful icon. Now, with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1354, the Ottomans conquered Istanbul, or Constantinople, and named it Istanbul, Istanbuli, in the city. They still called it the city. Well, of course, you couldn't hang around and be an iconographer there anymore because you were no longer the party in power. So the people fled. They went to Crete. And Crete was under the influence of the Venetians, and so those were their new patrons. So we see Western elements begin to creep into the language of Byzantine iconography. This reflects a big change. This is different. We see something dramatic here. The colors are bright, the image is dramatic, they're painted faster, economics have changed. That is incarnational thinking. You reflect the reality of where you are. So these are painted by Theophan the Cretan. He was a monk. He had actually been married. He had kids. And with his children, they became iconographers, and they painted several churches and monuments in Greece, and especially on Athos in Stavronikita Monastery, where we find Saint Demetrius on the right, Saint George on the left. And this, I was there, I went to Greece every year after my first year of seminary, and I was at this monastery, and they wake you up in the middle of the night, and then they knock on your door. They're going around giving the knock. That's how they knock on your door, and they say, Diaphon. That means you end your prayers and you come to church. Because they thought we were up all night praying. I was actually sleeping. So I get up and I go downstairs and I'm in the liturgy in Orthros. It's pitch black. But as the sun comes up, St. Demetrius and St. George appear before me. And suddenly I understood why icons. A very famous theologian, he was an Anglican priest, and he became an Orthodox, and now he's a bishop, Callistus Ware. He says before he became Orthodox, he went into a church, and it was weekday liturgy, and he says, these people don't care about church, there's nobody here. And as his eyes adjusted, he began to see, and the saints were all around him. And he realized, this place is so full, how do I fit in? We are the church militant surrounded by the church triumphant. So I understood ontologically the meaning of icons. So Orthodoxy has a tradition of when they go into a new culture as missionaries, they go into that culture, but they don't replace that culture. They baptize that culture. They take what is orthodox of that culture and they make it their own. So we see here, these are Russian icons, and these are actually painted by Father Greek, who went to Kiev, and he taught St. Andrei Rublev. And you see a bit of a change. The figures are no longer 7 and 8 heads high, they're 10 and 11 heads high, but they still follow the Byzantine technique and the Byzantine tradition. This is his famous student, Andrei Rublev, St. Andrei Rublev, who influenced for generations the iconographers. They say that he painted so lightly, they say he painted with smoke. His images were so translucent and so breathtakingly beautiful. You know the story of St. Vladimir when They were looking for a religion to follow. They went and visited the Muslims, they visited the Jews, they visited Hagia Sophia. They came back from Hagia Sophia and they said, we didn't know whether we were in heaven or on earth. It was so beautiful, it was so breathtaking. So they came back in 987 and all of Russia through Queen Olga and Prince Vladimir were baptized and became Orthodox, and now they're the largest Orthodox church in the world with over 200 million members. So, now that you're all experts at Byzantine iconography, I'm going to show you some portable icons. Portable icons became very important for the faithful, the devotion of the faithful at home, and also for procession. Here we see this is a Pomimnon style. It has that look of linear design. It also has silver around the edges, and you see that the borders are raised because they would carry these in processions, and sometimes the icons would be two-sided. So you'd see an icon coming, you'd see an icon going. Most of these are painted in egg tempera, some of them in encaustic, and then they usually have gold gilding. Here we have an encaustic icon. This is a pre-iconoclastic icon that they have in Mount Sinai. There's not many of those left because a lot of them were destroyed during the iconoclastic controversy. But this one is painted in wax. And it is a very famous icon because if you look at the face, you'll look that eyes are distinctly different. If you cover up one eye, you see an eye of compassion. You cover up the other eye, you see an eye of judgment. Some say that this is because Christ is perfect truth and perfect love. And that's why he can be our judge, because he loves us truly and perfectly. And the artist captured that reality in one image. Here's the image of Christ on the cross as if he was supporting it, as I mentioned earlier. And then here is an icon of the Virgin Mary. We call this the Odigitra. There's all kinds of names that come out of local traditions of devotion. So the Odigitra is the directress. She's directing us to Christ. I wanted to show you briefly the process so you can see what's involved in creating icons. Of course, in the 14th century, we didn't have Black & Deckers, but the preparation of the board was so important and so laborious that many times they would just cover over an existing icon and paint another one on top of it. A friend of mine brought an icon to Greece for restoration. It was a 17th century icon of St. John the Baptist. So he took it to restore it, photographed it, injected it to kill the worms, and then through the x-rays he discovered there were other icons underneath. And he said, can I remove the old icons to get down to the original icon? So it turns out there were 3 layers of icons, so they brought in a 17th century masterpiece, and then we had to get a 14th century masterpiece out of the country. So obviously I didn't go to jail over that one, but that was a trick. So we gesso a panel, and because wood is living, it cracks and moves and changes, so we use linen cloth on it to give it a stable base. And then we have a cartoon, and the cartoon is used, this is the mystical supper. We trace down the image, and then we gold gild. Gold gilding, 23-karat gold gilding, in this technique it's called style photo, which is burnished gold, but it makes it look like it is priceless. It also collects light and reflects it back to you. So if you're in a dark church, you'll see the gold glowing. It'll take the ambient light and reflect it back to you, so it is reflective of light. And then we begin to paint, and we paint from the back to the front. We call this process painting because we're building up layers one at a time. And we don't use oil paint because that paint is mixed on the surface and modeled on the surface. With this, what we do is we mix the paint and layer it and build it up. In this we see that it took place indoors. There's the architecture, and it was a festal time. You see the red curtains. Here I've set the table, And then here, this shows the development of the flesh tones. From over here on the left, in the base coat, a cold mid-tone. We had a glicasement, a cool green, and then we begin to highlight and add warmth, and then add black and white, and then we have the finished rendering. And we call this the mystical supper. Mystikos Lignos, not the Last Supper. And this shows, this is an icon by my teacher, and it shows the first two steps. So we have the propelasmo, means pre-plastimo, plasticizing before we begin to model. So before we model, we wash down the whole face, and then you see with layers of the first flesh tone how much variety, brushstroke by brushstroke, hundreds of thousands of brushstrokes building up the form. When I teach iconography, I tell students, what do they teach you when you go out to snow ski? They say, well, pizza and French fries. I said, why? So you don't kill anybody. You control yourself when you ski. So in iconography, we have to learn control. So this way you can build up the volumes and the forms of the face. And what we do is we work from the highlight towards the shadow, building it up, opening it up, the color all the way to white. And I just wanted to show you a few icons that I've done over the years. This is, of course, the Annunciation in the form of an epigonation. This was for a vestment for a priest. And the epigonation, the gondata, are the knees, and this is what an economos wears. That's a rank of priesthood who is a father confessor. And economos is the title of the economist. So he would collect the money from the collection and put it in there and then distribute it to the poor after the liturgy. This is my favorite icon, this late 13th century Armenian Ethiopian influence. It's a two-part icon. The upper part in the original is the crucifixion. So it joins those two festal scenes together. And I say this is the product of a great soul. This is a culture that understood intuitively the beauty of the Nativity. It's so full of joy and light. This is a Archangel Gabriel, and this is 12th century, and actually the original is somewhere in America. I don't know where it is, but I painted this and I sent it to my brother, who's married to a Baptist. And she informed me one time, she said, you know, we don't worship those things. And I said, well, neither do we. She said, and later on after I said this to her, she relayed the story to me. She said, we opened it up, we said, oh, it's insured for $300. What is this? And she opened it up and she began to weep. And I said, see, it sneaks past your defenses and it hits you in the heart. You are in the presence of the Archangel Gabriel. And that really moved her. And I think it surprised her. Here is a church I painted in Mexico City in the cathedral. And that I did back in 1996 because my roommate was transferred there and he was the priest there. And he says, Wayne, come down and paint our church. And I said, I can't. It's too expensive. He says, we'll give you lots of pesos. I said, all right, I'll do it. So I went down and I painted this church, and the scaffolding. Somebody had mortgaged their house to get the scaffolding, and we had the painter and the cook, and we had the chauffeur helping. Everybody was painting border designs while I painted. So we did this in a month together. And then this is the private chapel I painted in Mexico. A Greek man is head of a petroleum company down there, and he built a chapel in his backyard, and he asked me to decorate it. So I went down for 7 years once I was ordained, and worked for a couple weeks out of the year to decorate it. And this has a story. As you know, my brother studied in Leuven, Belgium, and he wanted to give the head of his doctoral committee a gift. So he says, can you paint an icon? So I said, sure, I'll send you an icon. So I sent him an icon, and I got a call a couple days later. can you paint another icon? I said, why? He says, because I'm keeping this one. I said, yeah, you're a smart guy. Okay, so I did. So this is an icon we call the Sotir. Sotir means Savior. So this is Christ the Savior. This is a Glycophilusa, the sweet kissing. And this is from Maranatha, another sweet kissing icon. And St. Nicholas. St. Demetrius, patron saint of Thessaloniki, where we lived for 6 years. My wife said to Demetrius when she left Stephanos there at 18 years old, watch over him, take care of our son. And he did. And this is our family icon, Christ the Sotir. And then these are some icons. I have a painting partner, Ari Kovaci, and he studied Greece 12 years. I studied 6 years. And he is one of the best painters I know. He's very fast, and his color sense is unbelievable. So this is a narthex in Atlanta, Georgia, Prophet Elias. You can see he has a lot of fun with color. I do drawings. These are icons we did together. This is our little parish in St. Philothea. We did this as an outreach to the university community and anybody who wanted to come. We opened it up and said, come watch us paint. We'll be painting for this week. So Sunday after church, I glued up canvas, I did the drawings, and Ari was in charge of landscape and garments. I did hands, hair, feet, lettering, and that sort of thing. So, so Monday morning, we came to work, and Ari was sitting in the pew, and he sat there. And he sat there. Finally I said, Ari, get to work. What are you doing? We're burning daylight. He says, I'm thinking. So he sat there for about 45 minutes, and what he did was he worked out the entire color scheme of the warm, the cool, the light, and dark. And when he was ready, he stood up, and he knocked that garment out in 15 minutes. I said, okay, do whatever you want. You know what you're doing. And this is on the other side, and this is the resurrection icon. We're a small community, about 50 families, but our main job as a church, when I came to that church, they said, Father Anthony, we want you on campus. And I said, all right. He says, we have a big university here. So I go on campus every Thursday, and I take my easel, and I set up my easel, and I paint. I used to go to talk to students about important things, and I usually end up eating lunch alone. So I said, well, I'm going to be here, I might as well work. And so when I started painting, then people started talking to me and asking me questions. And every Sunday we commemorate people during the Divine Liturgy, the living and those who've fallen asleep. And a paper came up, and it said, September 28th, 2017, Jack Reynolds. And I pointed to the kid next to me. I said, remember that? It was Jack Reynolds. He'd become Orthodox, and now he was helping me in the altar. And he smiled. I said, yeah, I remember that. So it's a great thing. This is the church we painted up in Cranston, Rhode Island. You can see the scaffolding and all the dust on the floor. We made a mess of things, but in the end they were pleased. And this is a church in New London, Connecticut. We painted. These were the first icons you see in the arches here. I had the Ascension and then Old Testament scenes on the other side. Eventually I added the Annunciation, and then they commissioned us to do the whole ceiling. And the whole ceiling was, since the church was Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, they used parables of Christ, the sower, the prodigal son, the great banquet, the rich man and Lazarus, starting at the back of the church working up. And it was Sophia. It was our journey to Theosis. So it just got harder and harder as you come. The front ones were the wise and foolish virgins and the Good Samaritan. And then at the very front, you can't see it very well, but there is the second coming of Christ. So, that's it for now. As you leave, you all get your silver bullet and a star. I'm deputizing you. You're all defenders of the faith. You're now all iconophiles. Any questions? See? You're all experts. Yes?
The shape that Mary is in, and it's,
Right.
what is that called?
That, she is, it's a bier. She's resting on the bier, in the nativity is what you're talking about, when she's resting. What's that? Oh, I'll repeat. Yeah, very good. Come on. This is my first rodeo. She asked, what is the shape of that the Virgin Mary is lying on in the nativity? And that is, she's lying on it's a bier or just a cushion. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering, as you were talking about the tradition, it was about they and we. And at this point, you're talking about I painted this church, these icons. Where does that come together? Where does the tradition and your decisions come together?
That's a good question. You asked about talking about they and we, and then I as the church. As iconographers, we're not Picassos and Matisses expressing our opinion. We are diaconi. We are servants of a tradition, and that's why what you see is really 4 major movements of iconography. It wasn't. The emphasis wasn't on style. The emphasis was on making the invisible visible. So that's having said that. At the same time, we're not scribes. We're not slavishly copying an ancient prototype of Jesus. What we're trying to do, what we said about the modernity and tradition is we have to communicate to the people in front of us. Well, in this particular day and age, that's a real challenge. People are oversaturated with media. Images don't mean much. So we have to go out there and take them by the hand and grab them and bring them in. So the church as a whole is trying to express the fullness of the faith, and that includes the art, the architecture, the music, all aspects of the faith. So artists, iconographers, are really just servants of the church. Now, if you go onto Pinterest, you will see that iconography is exploding around the world. The Romanians, the Russians, they're doing great things. They're doing a lot of good work. And since the economic downturn in Greece, we're getting a lot of very good iconographers over here in America. And this people are beginning to enter into this ontological, incarnational understanding of worship. That worship, liturgia, liturgy, that the Eucharistia, the Eucharist, is really where the rubber meets the road. That's why God said to the disciples, take, eat, this is my body. And what you have to do is you have to wrestle with that. One time at our spaghetti dinner, I had a Baptist and a Lutheran, and we were eating dinner together, and the Baptist says, well, we all pretty much believe the same thing. I said, well, let's test that. I said, the body and blood of Christ, is it essence or is it symbol? And each one simultaneously, symbol, essence. I said, well, okay. I guess we don't agree. But the reason it is the body and blood of Christ, that He gives us Himself, is because then what we do matters. And how we live matters. I tell people about confession. What did Christ say right before He ascended? Those whose sins on earth you forgive are forgiven in heaven. Those sins you retain are retained in heaven. Why would He say that if we're once saved, always saved? Because He knows that we would have amartia, that we would miss the mark. It's an archer's term. So in the East, we understand amartia as closer to or farther from perfection. Not you're good or you're bad, it's you're closer to, you're doing better or you're doing worse. When you're doing worse, rather than approach the cup to receive the body and blood of Christ unworthily, do what you have to. We're never worthy, but we have to do what we do. So we fast. Wednesdays and Fridays. I went to seminary and they said, let's see, there's 165 meat-eating days this year. I said, really? has. It said Apostles' Fast. Easter is early, so the Apostles' Fast begins early. So with that kind of ascetic discipline, we're called on to leave a light footprint on the earth. We're called to live an ascetic lifestyle. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Jordan Peterson, but he's big on the internet and blew up YouTube these days. But he's urging young men to clean up your room. Take responsibility for your life. What you do matters. Because if what you if what you do doesn't matter, you end up a nihilist. Nothing means anything. But life has meaning, and life has a purpose, and life has joy, and you find it by taking up as much responsibility as you can. So, good question. Yes?
In this
Right
picture
there.
here in the church,
Yes.
there's a stained glass window,
Yes.
and I was wondering what style was depicted there.
That is a good question. And she's asking about stained glass windows in churches. They originally didn't have stained glass window. They just had filtered glass. And because they didn't have electric lights, they would use those glasses to illuminate. And the icons would be painted very brightly because the light was dim. They'd be large. And they'd be painted on with coarse brush strokes so that your eye would adjust them. Later on, stained glass windows became more popular. They're not that popular in the East, but they are used. And what they developed is they use a Byzantine style in creating them. They're very, very high quality and beautiful. But it's not a real column element in the design of Byzantine churches. And you also notice that we don't use statues at all. Statues are maybe idols, perhaps, but you can get behind a statue. You can be out of relationship with a statue, but with a flat painting, you're always in relationship to it. Another question? Yes?
I've heard and read some time ago that icons are only painted as copies of earlier icons. Is that not true anymore?
Well, actually, we do. It's like the railroad track theory. George Corliss has done some really profound things with iconography. And that's because he knows his theology. And so he's able to tell us more and more about what things mean and why we do things. So we do work from prototypes, but just as nature, we borrow it from it. We're not slaves, we're not copying. Now the church itself will decide if an image is of its own. In Kastoria, outside of it's in western Greece, there are 67 Byzantine chapels. Because Kastoria was the place of exile for those who fell out of favor with the emperor. So they'd take their wealth there, they'd build a church, great thing, because we have 67 monuments decorated with iconography. Well, in one of those churches, there's an icon of the Holy Trinity with God as being an old man, big, Jesus sitting in his lap as a son, and the dove resting on Christ's lap. And they're saying this is the Trinity. Well, that was not repeated. We didn't use that image because it didn't reflect the theology of our church. So now we see Robert Lentz. He's doing a lot of iconography for the Catholics. But he's doing things that the Orthodox Church hasn't picked up. He's done Christ the Comanche Chief, which in our mind we say, well, no, Christ was a Jew. That's disincarnational. We don't have to make him something else to make him relational to all of time and all of creation. And so it takes it out. So we're baptized by the tradition, but part of that tradition is that we have to be invested in that, the flow of the church. The Holy Spirit didn't stop at the 7th century. We have Gregory Palamas in the 14th century telling us about Hezekiah. So the Holy Spirit continues to help us to understand what the revelation of Christ was. Any other questions? Yes?
The history of the presence of the image actually there's a belief that the image is actually a presence of the one depicted.
That's a good question. The distinction, and this is what Constantine V resisted iconography. He said because the icon cannot contain the divine essence. And he's right. It cannot. But what it does, and this took me 9 weeks to learn at seminary, the vocabulary of the Greeks, the hypostasy, the enerias, the ousia. So it was the hypostatic nature of Christ. Who is Christ? His personhood, his personality is the second person of the Trinity. He's perfect God and perfect man. His enerias, we experience God's energies. We do not experience his essence. Nobody can experience his essence. When Moses wanted to see God, he said, "You shall not see my face and live. So I'll put you in the crevice of a rock and I'll shield you." It's like the sun. If you go to the essence of the sun, you'd be vaporized. But we can experience the sun in an acceptable form at our distance as warmth on our face. It's still the sun, but it's at a level we can handle it. So images, the image does not contain the essence, but the hypostatic nature is represented by the image. So the reverence we give to the image is passed on to the original. Back in the day, they thought icons had magical powers, so they would scrape off the paint and eat it. But of course, they're eating cadmium and cobalt, heavy metals, so not a good thing. It would kill you. Yes?
I have a question about the icon. You said you painted for Todd when in Belgium.
Yes.
Because the figure looked to me very different from all these other figures.
Mm-hmm.
It looked to me, frankly, like the head was in the wrong place.
She's talking about the icon I gave to Todd. She said it looked different than the other images, and it was. It is called the extreme humility of Christ, and that is at his crucifixion. So he's shown having died, and it has the tools of salvation. That is the spear, the tomb, the cross, and the sponge, and the thorns and the nails sometimes, but not in this one. But she said the head looked like it was in a different position. This is the Komimnon style. It's a very expressive style, and it shows him asleep, almost like this. He's fallen asleep. He's dead. But it's a stylistic expression, and the actual icon is very large. And I think my teacher told me in Greece. He said the Komimnon style, this particular style, was the acme of the height of Byzantine iconography. And he says, but don't paint that way. He says, that's for the next life. And that's all you have to tell an artist. And of course I came back and started painting everything Komimnon, and my career came to a grinding halt. So I said, okay, better go back and rethink this. So I said, besides, I was really copying anyway, and I needed to start painting and enter into the expressive nature of Byzantine iconography. Yes?
You talked about the importance of the dome, referencing Hagia Sophia.
Yes.
Now the great basilicas in Rome, San Pietro, Maria Maggiore,
Yes.
are also domed.
Right.
There's a historical connection somewhere.
There is a historical connection. He's asking about the domes because Hagia Sophia was a dome, and then in Mary Maggiore in Rome they have domes. But what you see, a lot of the iconography in Italy is from the Komimnon period. San Marco, Cefalu. Those are beautiful Byzantine 12th century mosaics. So they were taking the architecture and the iconography. But what happens is during the Renaissance, iconography, well, there are a lot of things going on. A lot of things were happening in politics and in war and in Caesaropapism and all these different things that were going on. So there was the Dark Ages, and there was the period, kind of the death of that understanding. And then with the Renaissance, we begin to see the period of enlightenment. Then we see a new style of art taking over. And the Byzantines began to fall out of favor. Their understanding, that expressive, dynamic language of art began to die out. And that happened slowly, and by the 18th century, nobody was painting that way. In fact, most of the monasteries in Greece are painted now in a Western style that were painted from that period on. But the architecture and the art permeates a lot of Italy because a lot of the artists were going there and using that art and architecture. That's why we see it there. Palermo, Cavallo, San Marco. Yes? Yes?
I just was thinking, I saw the process of you showed us the process step by step of the wood.
Yeah.
I've always wondered about the mosaics that are made out of stone.
Right.
When they go into place, are they put in place and painted afterwards to make it shade, or are they using shaded stone?
Well, she's asking about the mosaics. Are the mosaics put in place then painted, or are they actually colored stones? And the answer is that they are actually colored stones, except the gold. That is a layer with glass on top of it. So underneath is green glass with a layer of gold leaf. And they're called tesserae. And they're little pieces in bins of color. And there's two ways to do mosaics. There's the direct set method, where you put it right into the wet cement. And there's the indirect method. And that is you do the drawing, you reverse it, and you glue the icons, the tesserae, down backwards on the paper, and then you put it into wet cement, wet the paper, pull it off once it's hard, and there you have your icon. So the mosaics they're old school, and the emperors, the ones that could afford mosaics. Fresco was seen as a cheap substitute, but it turned out that lasted pretty long, and now we're doing acrylic, and who knows what's going to happen to that in 100 years. Yes?
All right, so how would I explain to someone that a painting like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is not an icon, and what you drew was an icon?
Probably with a chokehold. Really get their attention. Yeah, what I said earlier about the language. Now, we use the word icon, icona in Greek, and specifically icona means image. So technically you are all icons. You're icons of God. So you represent the living God in you. The style that we paint is that we're not trying to remind people of nature. We're trying to transcend nature. So it's not totally abstract the way Kandinsky was, because then it just becomes purely spiritual and has no reference to the earth. But those icons, those paintings, we call them religious paintings. They're descriptive, but in their ousia, in their essence, in their ontology, they don't take us to that place. They tell us a story. They're descriptive. They're using models, and they're using, this world. There's a church up in Brumont, PA, and it was designed by a Jewish architect, and he put these beautiful long windows just surrounded the church so you could see outside. Well, that's not exactly the theology. We don't want to see the papacies coming in 20 minutes late, parking their car, fighting on the way in. It takes you out of the mood. So the way we use art and architecture is really to help the mind descend into the heart so that we can behold God in noetic prayer. So those kind of images, although they're beautiful artwork and they're beautiful painting, they're not icons. Okay? If that doesn't work, go with the chokehold.
Can you describe how your the different styles of iconography either weave or blend in with multi-cultures?
Okay, she asked about the different styles of iconography in each culture. What you have to remember is, I went to Cyprus a number of years ago, and I saw 11th century churches, and the iconography was absolutely wild. It was just totally expressive. And if you go to Coptic iconography, for instance, Coptic iconography is just kind of flat cartoon, symbolic drawings, but it's very profound because sometimes we can be profound in simplicity. Sometimes we hide behind complexity, but what you're looking for is the spiritual effect, the message that it's communicating. So Coptic iconography is very bold, it's flat, it's colorful, it's direct. Russian iconography reflects the personality of the people. Byzantine iconography, other than a few regional variations, say farther away you get from the center, the empire, you'll see variations. Iconography is not meant to oppress the artist, it's including the artist. You have a personality. If I taught you iconography and we always use the same prototype, the same brush, the same colors, we'd still end up with as many different icons because the personality is in there. And so when we go into cultures, you've heard of Babylon. Babylon, we have what we call from that called the spermatikos logos. That is the seeds of truth, that in Babylon, people all spoke the same language until God confused their languages and they took truth into their culture. So everywhere you go, people understand what life is all about. It's about love. It's about sharing. It's about giving. So St. Basil the Great says we should be like bumblebees. We should go and find truth wherever we can find it. And that way there's no barrier to the kingdom of God. Orthodox say we don't say where the Holy Spirit isn't. He blows where he will. We say where he is. The church is the church. It is the kingdom of God on earth. But it's not up to us to say who's saved, who's not saved, who's in, who's out. So with that understanding, as I said earlier about an accent, we all have an accent. We all have a personality. And so I asked my friend, Dr. Senkiran, I said about those churches in Cyprus. I said, were they just being kind of edgy, you know? Because those icons were really cool. He said, no, that's who they were. That was the essence of who they were. That's what they valued. To us it seems edgy. To them it was, this is our church. What do you mean? Light a candle, go up and pray. Knock it off. Yes?
Can you tell us again about the order of the created nature as we see it in church, from the dome all the way to where we sit or stand?
Yes. He's asking about the nature of creation, from the dome all the way to where we stand. And what I mentioned about after the resolution of the iconoclastic period is that is when the program began to develop the hierarchy of where images go. So we start with the Pantocrator, that is the all-powerful, the second person of the Trinity. We come down into the created order, that is angels, archangels, seraphim, cherubim. Then we come down into the prophets of the church, the pendentives, and then facing the church at the very front we have the beginning, the upper registry is the Dodekaioton, the 12 major feast days of the church. To the right and left we have Archangel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary and the Annunciation, and then you go clockwise around the church from the Nativity of Christ, the baptism of Christ, the presentation in the temple, etc., all the way around to the crucifixion, resurrection, Pentecost, Ascension, and Pentecost. Then below that, there's about 20 different programs you can use to design the church. So every church is not a carbon copy of each one. It depends on the personality, it depends on the people you're ministering to, it depends on the surrounding area. So usually on you can have the lives of the saints, you can have the miracles of Christ, the parables of Christ. There's many, many things to draw from. But when you get down to the bottom level, what you'll have usually is left, you'll have female saints, right, you'll have male saints, and they'll be about 3 feet off the ground because we're not on that level. They're above us. They are the church triumphant. We are the church militant. We are the ones working out our salvation. So there you have all of creation represented, and when you just celebrate the divine liturgy, the church is constituted. So on the paten we have the Lamb, and we have the Virgin Mary, and we have the 9 orders of saints, and then we have the living and the dead. We commemorate the bishop and the priest who celebrate the divine liturgy. So it's really a highly developed liturgical theology of what it is that's taking place. And I know we have liturgists in the group, so you can feel free to jump in. Any other?
No, you'll have to take that up with him after this.
All right, I'm getting the cane, so.
Visit and eat and maybe get signed autographs or something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.